Welcome everyone to our final meetup on Dostoevsky's Demons. It's amazing to finally reach the end of the road with this. I'm hoping it's a pleasant finish to our journey together. And I'm really looking forward to the final discussion today because we have a chance to look back and I guess share some of our takeaways. Whatever, this is going to be more open, I'm hoping, than some of the other meetings. You can go to any passage or anything really, any topic in the book that spoke to you. I think what we're going to do, the format-wise, is I want to quickly go through some of the quotations that were memorable to me. And then if you have a list of quotations you'd like to share, just type an exclamation point after as I'm getting close to being finished, and then I will open it up to everyone to share if you have prepared something. If you have not, that's okay too. But I want to start with with the people that actually have something maybe that they've written or something like more formal in terms of contributions to the discussion. So with that, I want to start with just the characters that we've been looking at for over 3 months now. And the first one that I want to just briefly touch on is Stepan Trofimovich Verkhovensky, the one that we started with, right? The very first chapter, we're introduced to this character, and a lot of you were asking if he is going to be the main character of the book. And I guess it's a pertinent question to re-raise. Is he actually the main character? He doesn't do a whole lot, but he's definitely the beginning and almost, he's there at the very end. We start with his life description, and then we end with his death. He's a very notable character. And I want to just, again, what I want to do is go through some of these characters, read a couple of memorable quotations or passages that I think characterize them or epitomize them in some way. And then hopefully you have, maybe I'll read some of the ones you have, and maybe you'll offer some of the ones that I didn't find or forgot about that were memorable to you. So here we go. Stepan Trofimovich Verkhovensky, quote number one that I thought was, that I remember even without necessarily looking for it. And the one that I associate him with is this one. And I declare that Shakespeare and Raphael are of higher value than the emancipation of the peasants, of higher value than the national principle, of higher value than socialism, of higher value than the younger generation, of higher value than chemistry, of higher value than almost all mankind, for they are already the fruit, the real fruit of mankind, and perhaps the most precious fruit they can possibly be. The ultimate form of beauty has already been achieved, and without that achievement, I would perhaps not agree to go on living. And then on the heels of that, there's another statement. I'll just mention the final argument that he has, which is, we can live without a lot of things. We can live without the Englishman, we can live without the German, but it is only without beauty that we cannot continue. For there will be nothing at all to do in the world. So without the beauty, nothing to do in the world, according to Stepan Trofimovich. And then at the very last, we read this passage last time, which is when he looks back and he's delirious, but he's in some ways maybe the most clairvoyant and the most prophetic in his diagnosis. And he says, a great many ideas are coming to me now. You see, it's just like our Russia. These demons who come out of the sick man and enter the swine. These are all the sores, all the contagions, all the uncleanness, all the demons, large and small, who have accumulated in our great and beloved sick man, our Russia, over the course of centuries. And this idea that we talked about last time, this idea of having a trauma, a historical trauma that is then never resolved, and it comes out in this violence, in this malcontent, and it becomes this demonic influence. I think it's such a deep thought. I think it is definitely true in Russia. It is so true. It's manifested now, I think, in a lot of ways. But it's probably true in American history as well, with all the issues that are coming to the forefront. that have never really been fully resolved, dealt with on a national scale. There's never been, the problem I think is there's never been really like a national unification of reconciliation, if you will, since the Civil War and some of these other things that have happened. The country has really never come together to be reconciled, to be unified, and these things continue to fester, and they cause violence, and they cause this demonic type of so that's something that I feel like, if there's a real contribution in terms of Dostoevsky and the study of history, I think that might be one of the great ones in my mind. This idea that this trauma of history is a ever present influence on us. And then finally, just before he dies, he says, the entire law of human existence consists merely in the fact that man has always been able to bow down before something immeasurably great. If people are deprived of what is immeasurably great, they will cease to live and will die in despair. The immeasurable and infinite are just as necessary to man as is the small planet on which he lives. And that's, I think, is another very interesting quotation. If you guys, want to talk about this, I think that's definitely something that is interesting. So before I go on to any other characters, maybe just so that I don't spend too much time and monopolize the time, anyone else, if you have a quote by Stepan Trofimovich Verkhovensky or a passage that you want to share, type in exclamation mark in the chat, and I will yield the floor. Otherwise, we'll go to the next character. And then, of course, we can come back to CJ. Go ahead. Of course, we can come back to all of these in our breakout rooms and the following discussion.
Well, there were several quotes I found that I like, but the one that to me characterizes the feel of the novel is from part 1, chapter 3, section E, another's sins, where Kirillov says, real.
Well, sorry, can you hold that quotation from Kirillov, because we'll go to him. I just want to I'm curious if anyone else has any quotations of Stepan Trofimovich specifically.
Oh, okay, I missed that.
Oh, sorry, I'm trying to create a sort of composite image so that if it's not just my quotations, that maybe you can bring some of your own. So Allison, do you have one?
So I'm not at home, actually. I'm actually in New York right now. And I don't have my book with me. So I had a quote, but I have no idea who said it. So I don't know.
Okay, let's throw it out there.
I don't know. Sorry, it's if you want to overcome the whole world, overcome yourself. I don't know if that was him or not. I Googled quotes from this and I was like,
That's
I remember that.
Yeah, I'm not sure
I don't know
who
who
would
said
say that. Maybe Kirillov too.
Yeah.
But,
yeah, I
okay.
wasn't sure if I was able to make this one or not. So
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Anyone else on Doug? Go ahead.
I had one from Stepan, and it's right at the conclusion of his speech in front of the big gala. And it just leaped out at me when I was just opening up the book. And it says, and it's really from the Bible. It's a biblical reference of what missionaries and evangelists do if they've hit a house that's inhospitable. And it's like, I shake the dust from my feet and I curse you. This is the end, the end. And so that sort of personifies, I think, Stepan's sense that he's a great prophet, but it only emerges when he's enraged by the crowd. I think up to that point, he's talking about, I don't know, love or whatever. I mean, he goes all over the place. He just jumps things. But that was interesting to me, how much the Bible undergirds a lot of this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to teach you, but I curse you because you will not listen to me. And shake the dust from your feet when you leave the house.
I like that quote because it's very theatrical. And I guess you appreciate it as a man of visual arts and theater. Yeah, he's very theatrical for sure. And by the way, I wanted to mention this one thing. One of the reasons why I really love these discussions that we have is because everyone brings a unique perspective and makes unique connections that individually we would not necessarily make otherwise, unless we were in a group setting. And Doug, you made this connection last time, and it really stuck with me. I want to bring it up now because we're talking about Stepan Trofimовich Verkhovensky, and the connection was comparing him to Don Quixote. And I really started thinking about that, and it kept, especially I was thinking about the Don Quixote's deathbed recanting of his life, of his beliefs prior to that, and just comparing the two men and their sort of ending speeches, and also life, right? Like, we're talking about how they fight with these monsters who are not real. They make up these sort of windmills that of the mind that are not there, and then spend their entire life having this theatrical pose. And I really like that. I really think that's a great lens to look at Stepan Trofimовich as a sort of a modern day Don Quixote, who is, when he goes on that road, that's his beginning of awakening, right? He goes off from his comfort level, and he starts looking at real life, and all of a sudden he realizes he's never encountered real life before. So it's what a great, I think that's a great comparison. I just want to bring that up, and thank you, Doug, for mentioning that, because that really got me thinking along those lines.
Thank you for bringing it up. I'd actually forgotten that.
No, definitely was one of the, like I said, I really value these groups because of this type of connecting the dots that we would not necessarily otherwise make connections with. Let's see, do we have anyone else? Okay, so we'll come back to Stepan Trofimовich. He's obviously everybody's favorite character here, and let's go to Kirillov, and CJ, I'm going to give you the chance now, because you had something already prepared, and then I'll maybe see if we have similar quotes from him.
Yeah, well, I just had the one from part 1, chapter 3, section 8, Another Sins, which to me characterizes a lot of the feeling of the whole novel. Real freedom will come when it doesn't make any difference whether you live or not. That's the final goal. This just the contradictoriness of that fits in with the whole theme where Dostoevsky's characters are so ambiguous. At one moment you're inspired and wow, that's a great person. The next moment they're dastardly. And the whole ambivalence about socialism and the revolutionary movements, it's all contradictory in formulation, and I thought Kirillov's quote there sort of symbolizes for me that tension, logical absurdity of it all.
Interesting. That's a good one. I have a couple more, but looks like Madeline, do you have one as well?
Well, I have the print version of the book here, and I can't find what I'm looking for. Maybe you know where it is. It's the part where Kirillov, he's talking about a big rock hanging over everyone's heads, and what it's like to live your life standing right underneath that. The fear of being crushed by the rock.
Yeah, I think that's is that a discussion that he had with Stavrogin?
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone know where that was?
Well, unfortunately, we all have different editions, so I'm not sure if it's going to help in terms of page numbers. Does anybody, can anybody help with maybe a chapter or section?
Hey, you know what? I'll just keep thumbing through it, and if I come across it, I will interject with it later, because it was really one of my favorite passages in the book.
Can you summarize it again? I'm sorry. I missed it.
Kirillov is talking about something being like standing underneath a huge rock that is suspended over your head, and knowing that it could fall at any time and crush you, and what that the fear of the rock falling on you is worse than the act, what would it be, less than a moment's worth of pain if the rock actually fell?
Right. It's kind of like the sort of Damocles type of situation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I was teasing some of my quotes from him from that same from that same general area, but that one did not jump out at me. But it is a good one, and I think it explains his rebellion, I guess, in some way against sort of the order of things and how he wants to deal with it. Let me read a couple of mine, and maybe we'll maybe in the meantime maybe you can find the exact passage. So the one I have is where they have a dialogue with Stavrogin, and Stavrogin asks him, "You've begun to believe in a future eternal life?" "No, not in a future eternal life, but in eternal life right here. There are moments, you reach moments, and time suddenly stops, and it will become eternal. You hope to reach such a moment?" "Yes." "That's hardly possible in our time," Nikolai Vsevovich responded, also without any irony. "In the apocalypse, the angel swears that time will no longer exist." And then they talk about how he stopped his clock at the time when he figured he reached that moment of this absoluteness, this absolute happiness that he claims he has. And as a symbol of that, he stopped the time because once you reach this happiness, that's it. There's no more reason for time passing, I guess. So that was one that I really liked, this idea of time stopping and eternal life, not somewhere out there, but a moment in time that is eternal. And I guess the one that he's trying to capture in his present life. And then another one that follows on the heels of that is this idea of happiness and unhappiness. And he talks about the leaf. And I think a lot of you, I don't know, when we last talked about it, I saw that people were not like getting this leaf thing. But I want to bring it up again. So Kirillov says, "Not long ago, I saw a yellow leaf with some green in it, turning brown at the edges, blown by the wind. When I was 10, I used to close my eyes on purpose in winter and picture a leaf, green and bright with veins in it and the sun shining. I'd open my eyes and couldn't believe it because it was so very good. And then I'd close them again." "What is this anyway, an allegory?" Stavrogin asked. No, why should it be? It's not an allegory, just a leaf. Nothing but a leaf. The leaf is good. Everything is good. Everything? Everything. Man is unhappy because he doesn't know he's happy. That's the only reason. That's everything, everything. Whoever finds out will become happy right away, this minute. And that's another thought that I think is very, interesting. And I'm curious if anybody else thinks that there's any significance to it, or if it puzzles you or bothers you maybe. Just this idea that the problem with man is not some economic or some external thing. It's the fact that we think we don't know we're happy. And if the moment we knew, at least according to Kirillov, the moment if we knew we were happy, we actually would be happy. But we don't know, and so we're unhappy. This combo. And then of course Stavrogin asks him and challenges him about this idea that everything is good, everybody's good, and it says, "Anyone who teaches that all are good, he will bring about the end of the world." Stavrogin says, "The one who taught was crucified. He will come, and his name will be Man God." "You mean God man?" "No, Man God. That's the difference." So this idea that man who realizes this idea of happiness, this idea of eternal life now, this idea of sort of controlling your destiny, that's the same kind of Christ-like figure that was there before, but not sufficient to change the world. I think is very intriguing and interesting about Kirillov. He's definitely an interesting, very philosophical type of person, and interesting character in the book. Let's see. Oh yeah. So last time, maybe it wasn't the last time, maybe 2 meetings ago, we were talking about Kirillov saying that somehow his death will save others. Do you remember that? We were talking about that. And so this passage that or this quote I have from him is talking about that. And maybe I'm curious if anyone else has had any more insights on that. So he says, to realize that God does not exist and not to realize at the same time that you yourself have become God is absurd. Otherwise, you'd certainly kill yourself. If you realize that you are a czar and you will no longer kill yourself, but will live in the greatest glory. But one man, the one who is first, must kill himself without fail. Otherwise, who will begin and prove it? I will kill myself without fail in order to begin and prove it. In other words, I think he is saying that this realization that there is no God, it almost obliges the first person who realizes it to do the ultimate act of self-will, which is and to kill himself, not for any other reason, but for that. And by doing so, he opens up the way for everyone else to then express themselves in different ways. But the first person who realizes it has to do this. And maybe that's like this Messiah-like position that he takes. Like I'm going to be the one to sacrifice myself for everyone else to be able to exercise their self-will in order to live. But the first one who realizes it has to die, has to commit the ultimate act of self-will and freedom, which is to kill oneself, not for any like external reason, but for this idea alone. I'm curious if anyone else has any thoughts on any of this stuff with Kirillov before we, Maritza, go ahead.
I have one thing, and I've been reading.
Maybe just let Maritza and then I'll
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, please, Maritza. You're muted if I didn't.
Okay. No, I wouldn't have minded waiting. So, Kirillov is one of my favorite characters in this book. And that passage to me is, it's very powerful. Like he's most true throughout the entire book and very direct. And I like it makes a lot of sense. The idea, like he's so willing to stand by his convictions that he is taking on this Messiah role. And it makes me think of the hero's journey. The hero he has to go past the fear. He has to find the courage and to go, do the thing and then bring it back to the community. And in his mind, that first person making that sacrifice is the one going and bringing back the good for everyone else. I think that's very admirable. And it's this commitment to, doing so on one's own terms. It's when you talked about him talking about how, people are only unhappy because they don't know they're happy. That was the conversation he was having with Nikolai. And I don't know. So in that section, if I remember correctly, Nikolai was saying to him, "Oh, you're gonna believe in God." Like he seemed not to take Kirillov seriously. And it was what was interesting to me was that he didn't get angry. He just told him, "Oh, you're not right. You're distorting this idea." And then he said to him a quote that I like. He says, "Remember what you have meant in my life, Stavrogan." And that to me was impactful because here's Kirillov speaking of these things that he profoundly believes to the point where he's taking on this mantle where he believes he's going to have to kill himself. And Nikolai is cracking jokes. "Oh, by the time I see you next week, you're going to be a religious dude." And this guy says, "Remember how much you have meant to me." And it's kind of like, to me, it just felt like, I can handle whatever you're throwing at me. It doesn't shake any of my resolve. And so I kind of like the just that comparison. And he doesn't like, he has these amazing dialogues throughout the book with various people. And what I find is more than them revealing him to us, they're revealing the other character. Like, I understood Nikolai a little bit better after that interaction. And then when he had the interaction with Piotr, it was the same. Like I understood that character a little bit more for the dialogue he had with Kirillov. Another section that I really like, a quote. I don't remember the direct quote, and I didn't write it down, but he says to Piotr, killing someone else is the act of, I think he said cowardly individual. It was the fact that you would go to that your mind
Yeah,
goes to that.
I know which one you're talking. Yeah,
Speaks volumes to your character, and the disdain that he had for Piotr just spoke volumes to the picture that was painted for that character.
Yeah, I like that. I like that one too. I know which one you're talking about. He says, killing someone else is the most lowly act of self-will you can think of. But killing oneself, like that's the highest. But killing someone else, in other words, forcing my will onto someone else's will, that's the worst thing you can do with.
Right,
with
and that's a statement that you can really wrap your mind around for quite some time. The idea of and that's the whole starting from within and going out, acting outward, whereas you're abdicating a responsibility if you go off to kill someone else for your beliefs, which is an interesting commentary, especially considering the whole total of what the book was about.
Right. Thank you, Maurice. This is great. Doug, and then Allison.
Well, this last week, I've been really a lot of it in the last day, read the whole thing again today, is Camus' adaptation of The Possessed. And a lot of Camus' essays are trying to prove it's wrong to commit suicide and it's wrong to murder. And I can see why now he's so obsessed with this novel, because it's meditations on suicide and murder. And this thing about the leaf is interesting because he distills it in almost a poem-like condensity. He does some things where he just cuts them out completely. And then there are other things where he really compacts actions where you can see things clearly. And so I like some of it and I don't, but he says, it's Stavrogan and Kirillov, and he says, Stavrogan says, are you still firm in your intention? Kirillov says, yes. I mean, in regard to suicide, I understand what you meant. Yes, I have the same intentions. Ah, and when will it be? Soon. You seem very happy. I am. I understand that. I have sometimes thought of it. This is Stavrogan. Just imagine that you have committed a crime, or rather a particularly cowardly, shameful deed, well, a bullet in the head and everything ceases to exist. What does shame matter then? And Kirillov says, that's not why I'm happy. And he goes, why then? Have you ever looked at a leaf of a tree? Yes, green and shiny with all its veins visible in the sunlight. Isn't it wonderful? Yes, a leaf justifies everything. Human beings, birth and death, everything one does is good. And even if, he stops, well, if a man harms one of those children you love, and Kirillov really loves children, a little girl, for instance, if he dishonors her, is that good too? Staring at him in silence. Did you do that? Stavrogan shakes his head oddly in silence. Kirillov says, if a man commits such a crime, that is good too. And if someone splits open the head of a man who dishonored a child, or if, on the other hand, he is forgiven, all that is good. When we know that once and for all, then we are happy. When did you discover that you were happy? Last Wednesday during the night at 2:35 or 2:35. And it reminds me of the end of The Stranger, where he's killed a man almost whimsically, and then on the eve of his execution, in the middle of the night, he sees the stars or something. And it's a beauty, and he realizes he's really missed the whole point of life. And so that's always been a very strange ending, the novel. In fact, the end of Monsieur Verdoux, Chaplin's Monsieur Verdoux, is almost the same, where somebody offers Chaplin's character, who's a Bluebeard kind of character, who marries rich women and supports his family through murdering them. And he's executed, and somebody says, would you like some brandy? He says, I don't drink. And he goes, oh, I've never tasted brandy. And he has a sip of the brandy and he has this moment of beauty, and then he's walking to the guillotine. It's like that's sort of, that does flare up. And Kirillov is one of the best, just the way he'll chase a ball under a bed, or the way he exercises, or the way he does certain things. He sort of,
it's kind of living in the moment, would you say?
What?
He lives in the moment.
Yeah, it's like a Zen-like crispness, that ability to just look at a leaf and sort of,
Yeah, it's very
or
Zen. Yeah, I
William
totally
Blake,
agree.
you know, see God in a grain of sand or see beauty, you know, I mean,
Right, right.
it,
Absolutely.
it's very interesting.
Mm. Yep.
I haven't said that to myself, but I think Maurice right. I think in some ways he is my favorite character. He's like, there's something so, I don't know, interesting about him.
Yeah, he's hard to pin down in some ways, right?
Well, and then the woman who takes care of Stepan just has an instinct that this guy's wounded, I'll take care of him. She's a very interesting character too.
Yeah.
Uh,
Thank you, Doug. Allison?
Yeah, I always thought that depression, that people commit suicide because of depression and they're trying to escape their pain. But what's interesting is like he made me realize that maybe people are doing it because they want to gain control when they don't feel that they have control of anything. Like I've always like when people have a like a Robin Williams, you know, like if you have a disease that you know is going to kill you, and then they go and they kill themselves. And I always thought, well, why would you do that? Because, you know, you could have had a number of happy days before that. Like, why would you deprive yourself of that early? But I guess that's their way of feeling they've just taken control back in a situation that's completely out of their control.
Right.
So it's interesting, like connecting that to his idea of, you know.
Right. Although he does keep insisting that he's different in that sense, because most people commit suicide because of some external hardship that they're experiencing. And he makes he wants to be distinct from that. He says, I'm in a class of my own. I don't have anything pushing me to this. I'm okay, so to speak. But the whole point of this is to show that it's my will. It's my, I keep saying that it's my will. It's my decision. It's like, I am doing this for, like, I'm not insane. I'm completely in control of my senses and my faculties. I want to read one more passage that I meant to read a bit earlier of his that I think really pinpoints this. He says, if God exists, then all will is his, and I can't escape his will. If he does not exist, then all will is mine, and I am obliged to proclaim self-will. Stavrogan says self-will, or this is actually later. This is with Piotr. He's discussing committing suicide. Piotr says, self-will, why are you obliged to proclaim it? Because all will has become mine. Can it really be that no one on this entire planet, once having put an end to God and having developed a belief in self-will, will dare to proclaim self-will in the fullest possible sense? It's like a poor man who has received an inheritance and is frightened by it and doesn't dare come near the bag full of money, regarding himself as too feeble to possess it. This idea that the realization that there is no divinity, no God, is like inheriting something you did not have is also a very interesting concept. Now, Nietzsche, I think, kind of decries this idea that there is no God, and he thinks it's well, he kind of celebrates it, but he also, I think he says it's a fearful thing. But to Kirillov, it's undoubtedly the a bonus, right? It's a treasure that there is no God, and therefore all will is mine. I think I'm trying to think. I think it's in some other novel of Dostoevsky. I forget if it's Crime and Punishment or some other one, but it says if there is no God, then everything is allowed, and that's of course is a terrible consequence socially. But Kirillov doesn't think in those terms. He doesn't think about society. He doesn't think about any sort of big picture. He thinks about individual. Brothers Karamazov. Yes, it is. Yes, that's right. If there's no God, everything is allowed. But Kirillov thinks it's it's like the start of utopia, and he's going to be the one to usher it in by doing this grand gesture of killing himself. Anyone else who wants to add anything to that on Kirillov before we move on to some other characters? Madeline.
Okay, I actually found the passage.
Great.
Well, I certainly agree about the leaf. That was a marvel of writing. And it perfectly captured that kind of moment you have. You know, when you just want to sort of stop where you are and shout to the world, look, this leaf, you know? or whatever the thing is. It's also, I think it's the only moment in the novel where someone is having a direct, unmediated experience of nature that doesn't form just sort of a background, like it was raining or he threw him in the mud or the storm delayed the ferry. And so it's a very rare moment in the novel for that as well. Anyway, I found the passage on the rock.
Mhm.
I remember it as being much longer, but I think it's because I rewound it and re-listened to it a few times. And the funny thing is, I remember exactly where I was walking in the park where I was doing that. And it's odd how we remember things in our bodies like that, how a memory will have a context like that. Whereas when it's in the print book, it was very hard to find. So he's talking with, it's in part 1, it's in a chapter called Someone Else's Sins. And Kirillov is talking with the first person narrator. And so the narrator is saying, and what in your opinion keeps people from suicide, I asked. 2 prejudices keep them, 2 things, one very big, one very small, the other very big. But the small one is also very big. What is the small one? Pain. Pain? Is it really so important in this case? And Kirillov says, the foremost thing. So remember, this was during a time in Russia when there was basically an epidemic of suicides. So it was a kind of a major theme in the culture at that point. Foremost thing. There are 2 sorts, those who kill themselves from great sorrow or anger or the crazy ones or whatever. They do it suddenly. They think little about pain and do it suddenly. But the ones who do it judiciously, they think a lot. And if it weren't for prejudice, there'd be very many, everybody. Then the first person narrator says, but aren't there ways of dying without pain? Imagine, he stopped in front of me. Imagine a stone the size of a big house. It's hanging there and you are under it. If it falls on you, on your head, will it be painful? A stone as big as a house? Naturally, it's frightening. Fright is not the point. Will it be painful? A stone as big as a mountain, millions of pounds? Of course, it wouldn't be painful at all. And Kirillov says, but go and stand there in reality. And while it's hanging, you'll be very much afraid of the pain. Every foremost scientist, foremost doctor, all of them will be very afraid. They'll all know it won't be painful, but they'll all be very afraid it will be. And then the narrator says, well, and the second reason, the big one, the other world. So then a number of paragraphs on, he says, the narrator asks, so this God exists in your opinion? Oh, I see, okay. Sorry, Kirillov says, man now is not yet the right man. There will be a new man, happy and proud. He for whom it will make no difference whether he lives or does not live, he will be the new man. He who overcomes pain and fear will himself be God, and this God will not be. So this God exists in your opinion? He doesn't, yet he does. There is no pain in the stone, but there is pain in the fear of the stone. So God is the pain of the fear of death. He who overcomes pain and fear will himself become God. Then there will be a new life, a new man, everything new. So that was the passage about the stone. And there seem to be many things involved in that. We have, as you all just discussed, we have Kirillov as sort of the kind of the new Christ. He's the first one to discover this, and he's willing to sacrifice himself so that everyone who comes after him will know it. Although looking at it from the outside, if you don't know his philosophy, it's such an incoherent act. And like the note that he leaves, you wouldn't get that from it. You wouldn't know that he had become the new God by doing this. But that fear of God that's hanging over him, which is the pain of the fear of death, he's equating God basically with fear.
Right,
The
right.
knowledge of God is fear. Fear of the other world, fear of death, just fear, period.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a big thing for Dostoevsky to write. Of course, he himself believes the opposite, right? He believes God is love and all this other stuff that he puts in the mouth of Stepan Trofimovich just before he dies. So it's actually amazing that he's so good at presenting the opposite opinion, right? He's steel manning the opposite opinion very well, I think. Like, he expresses this nihilist view of atheism and sort of this humanism, right? Man is the measure of all things, and man is the kind of Nietzschean Ubermensch, right? The Superman that triumphs over everything, even in his death and so forth. Yet he himself doesn't obviously believe that. But I think he's making he is enunciating that argument quite well. Maybe better than he wanted to, I think.
Well, I think it goes back to what the discussion we had, I think it was last time, and something you said about there's a sense in which this could be seen as a very Christian novel, because he gets inside the soul of each character, even those he disagrees with, and even the really minor characters, people who are diametrically opposed or are kind of stock characters like von Lemke. He kind of gets inside all of them in a very beautiful way.
Yes, he's very sympathetic to even the most cruel and, well, I don't know about Peter Verhovensky, maybe the only example. I'm not sure there's a lot of sympathy there, but almost everyone else, I think he's very, very sympathetic to them in how he describes them. With that in mind, I want to go to the character that is probably most sympathetic to Dostoevsky himself in terms of his belief structure. That's Shatov, right? Shatov, our lamb led to the slaughter, the sacrificial lamb, if you will, the one who we all were hoping would escape his doom, but he didn't. So with Shatov, I have some really maybe memorable quotes. I'm curious if you also have ones I missed. So the first one I want to mention is this one. When he talks to Stavrogin, he says, "Wasn't it you who told me that if it were to be mathematically proven to you that the truth existed apart from Christ, then you would rather remain with Christ than with the truth? Did you say that? Did you?" And obviously it implies kind of that Shatov himself believes that. But that was this idea that there are some things that are more important than, quote, rational truth. And then, of course, he continues in that vein with this longer passage where he says, "Not one people has ever yet organized itself according to the principles of science and reason. Never has there been a single example of that, except only for a brief moment and out of stupidity. Socialism, by its very nature, must be atheism, for it has specifically proclaimed from its very first words that it is an atheistic construct and is intentionally organized exclusively according to the principles of science and reason." And then he says, "Reason and science in the life of peoples always, now and from the beginning of time, have fulfilled merely a secondary and auxiliary function, and that will be their function until the end of time. Peoples are formed and moved by another force that rules and dominates them, but whose origin is unknown and inexplicable. This force is the force of an unquenchable desire to go on to the end, while at the same time denying the end. This is the force of a ceaseless and tireless affirmation of its own being and denial of death. The goal of all movements of all peoples in every period of its existence is nothing but a search for God, its own God, unquestionably its own, and faith in him is the only true one." So it's almost the opposite of Kirillov's statement of faith. We have Shatov, who is the antithesis of that nihilist sort of denial of divinity, and Shatov, who is saying, in fact, it's the opposite. The very purpose of every people and every nation under heaven is to find its own truth, its own God, and without that, all these other reasonable things based on science, reason, and all this other stuff is really like nonsense. I thought this was very powerfully stated, especially the part about reason. He later says, "Reason has never had the power of defining evil and good, or separating evil from good, even approximately. On the contrary, it has always mixed them up in the most shameful and pitiful fashion, whereas science has found solutions by sheer force. And then he talks about half science. And I guess with half science, where he says half science is a despot, such as has never been seen until now, a despot who has his own high priest and slaves, a despot before whom all have prostrated themselves with love and superstition, such as has been unthinkable until now. And actually, this last part I actually think is most prescient because of the role that science has had in our sort of political discourse and public discourse, and the role of science. And politicians always appeal to science to try to promulgate some new law or some policy decision. And the role of science is truly remarkable today as a part of like social and political discourse, whereas before it was never that. It was always something about some appeal to authority or morality or something along the lines of tradition or some other, but never really, like, science has never really been the motive force. And it's a new thing, relatively new thing, and we're still experimenting with that. Anyone else has any quotes from Shadov that they want to share? Or any thoughts on these passages that?
Well, I actually highlighted the same passage.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, so I think it's like its most clear form, like this of his criticism of modernity. I think it's one of the most important passages in the book, that science is no longer not sufficient in order to hold a nation together. And this is where you can kind of see where Dostoevsky is clearly turning towards God. I mean, in the sense that, and specifically, I mean, it gets into a Christian God, but any God, though. And the fact that, I had exactly the same, not a single nation has ever been founded on the principles of science and reason. There has never been an example of it, except in a brief moment through folly. I mean, socialism is from its very nature bound to atheism. And I think that this is actually really where it's probably the most, I don't know, it's the most stark statement, I think, in the entire book, where he kind of starts, where he's criticizing modernity and essentially what would be of this adherence to science as a religion. So, I mean, I thought that was pretty much one of the most important passages.
And it's pretty clear what he's alluding to when he talks about, except for a short period,
Right.
European history was still reeling from the French Revolution, and their attempt to completely throw out, the baby, the bathwater, and the bathtub of tradition and history. When they tried to do away with the 7-day week, they tried to do like a 10-day week. They went with metric measure instead of like the old measures. Some of these things have stuck, but most of them, of course, didn't. And it was just a spectacular failure, which ended up with ironically, with the same thing that we read from Shigalov in his grand theory. It starts out with perfect freedom and ends up with perfect despotism.
That was something else I highlighted as well. Yeah, is Shigalovism. Yeah,
yes.
And then Peter's critique of that as well.
Yeah. Okay, we have a couple of people here. Madeline, and then Maritza, and then Doug.
Yes, that world of science and modernity. In the Rock passage, he says even doctors and learned scientists would experience that fear of the rock. And if the rock is a metaphor for God. And then the other is at the very end of that passage. I didn't read it, but he sort of tapers off for a moment and says, evolving towards God something, and the narrator prompts gorillas. So I think that there was also that scene at the party where the student girl who's into women's rights talks about how the old gods developed, how the old beliefs developed from people looking at lightning. And so clearly science was making its way in. People had either read Darwin or read about Darwin's theories.
Mm-hmm.
And we're starting to see that people had evolved through time, not necessarily from gorillas, but at the time that seemed to be the thing.
Right.
Evolved from gorillas, and also that our religious beliefs came about through human evolution, from seeing lightning in the sky. And so that's something it's pretty widespread right now. But at the time, I can see that it would have been just sort of dismantling society in a way. That all these givens and all of this received wisdom and the idea of continuing to do things exactly what your ancestors did, the way that they did it, because those were the things that worked. But now it turns out that those are intellectually wrong, as well as the problem with the peasants. So they're socially wrong as well.
Right. I do want to say just quickly mention that in that passage you're alluding to with a girl who was pro-feminist movement or whatever, she gets rebuked by this older gentleman who says, "You're just repeating whatever they told you." And if there was another guy who taught you how to light candles, you'd be lighting candles in church, which I thought was very good. And it's very apropos, like a lot of these students who think they've discovered the world because, they've listened to a course on comparative religion or something, as if, no one else in the world has that same understanding. And of course, if they had heard something completely different, they would be repeating something completely different. And, this idea that there's something more to knowledge and learning than just repeating someone else's mental process and regurgitating like a parrot. Research and knowledge is not about repetition and authority, which is really what that is. Appeal to new authority. Whereas we had religious authority before, now it's this authority of science and scientific learning, which in itself is probably great, but the way it's kind of works itself out is it's just a new appeal to authority. And we keep stumbling over that in today's society as well. We keep struggling with this concept of science being an anti-authority thing, right, by definition, and yet a need for some kind of authority in society, because everybody can't just claim to be Galileo. That leads to chaos. So anyway,
I think I liked your point about what it's like to be, that young, to be that kind of student and come across an idea, and that feeling, it is like coming across that leaf. It is like that moment. And I thought that the older man, who I think was her uncle, it was a very, very effective put down, because he basically said that you got your feminist ideas from a man, and if the man had said something else, you wouldn't have feminist ideas.
Exactly. Yeah, that's something. I mean, I love this thing. He's so good at some of the sarcastic stuff. Really, he could have been a stand-up comedian, I think, in another life. Maritza and Doug.
Actually, so in the comments, Doug questioned whether or not there was a conflation here for atheism versus nihilism. And, I have oscillated back and forth asking myself the same question, because I didn't get the feeling that Kirillov felt that all of life had no meaning. I think a quote of his is, if, what is it? I think I have it here. Hold on, let me, yes, he says, God is necessary and therefore must exist, but I know that he does not and cannot exist. Don't you understand that a man with these two thoughts cannot go on living? But that to me that would be almost more atheist in nature, in the idea of they don't believe in religion, but maybe from a literal perspective, perhaps that could go into nihilism. But then I remember we determined that nihilism, in most of Dostoevsky's tales, he's actually referencing the Russian nihilism, not what would be more standard nihilism to us. And so I was thinking that maybe that's why we don't see in Kirillov this ennui of there being nothing, because he seems like, to me, he seems more full of life than some of these other characters, even despite this conviction of needing to die or to kill himself. So I think so in the
I agree with you.
I didn't find huge amounts of information on Russian nihilism thus far yet. I haven't spent too much time researching, but I did. There's like I found out one little thing that says that it's they were mostly a generation of young, radical, non-gentry intellectuals, and they were what they were upholding was materialism, positivism, and scientism.
That's Russian nihilist.
Russian nihilism. This article here is by a guy it's from the Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and this guy is Stephen Lovell. Wrote this long article on the nihilist movement and nihilist doctrine. And so I think like he was saying, for them, what was primary was social change. So I found it interesting. If you look at it from that angle, then we see this character here who is so convinced in the necessity for change that he's willing to die for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I just can't get away from that being just an admirable trait. I find him to be so true to himself. And
Maritza, can you post a link to that?
Yes, absolutely. Sure.
I don't think of Kirillov as a nihilist in a sense of denying existing social structures. I don't think he cares, or maybe I shouldn't say I don't think the traditional view of nihilists are people that they want to burn the world, uproot everything that is because it's not worth saving. And in that they're denying its existence. They want to actively destroy it first. They don't want to fix anything. They're revolutionaries. But he strikes me as a person who is nonviolent in his sort of approach. He wants to change the world by changing people in the world, not by saying, let's burn down buildings or throw rocks at churches or things like that.
I see something more admirable even, Philip.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't want to change people. He wants to bring about change through an action of his own, which to me, that's seems a small point, but as one who believes that we can't change others, we can only change ourselves. I see that in him, and it really resonates with me. He wants to change the world, but he really believes the way to do it is to start with himself. And I think
right,
that's great.
Right. Doug, and then Madeline.
I'm muted there. The question about the conflation of atheism and nihilism, that's actually from DLJ. My initials are DWJ. And so I'll let him speak to that. But that is a good question, I think. And I could very easily, and in a way, I'm speaking to that question because something Joe said, the conflation of nihilism with atheism, or I can't remember how he phrased it, but it was something I've gone around and around on my whole life. And
socialism with atheism, I think that's what he said.
Yeah, socialism with atheism.
Yes. Oh, that's right. And that is actually what I wanted to speak to specifically, because socialism really comes out of the Jewish prophets and the early Christian church. And so communism, the early Christian church is communistic, basically. And the only experiment successful in America in communism in the USA was within the Mormon Church, which went on for decades and was called the United Order, and it was rather successful. And then Republican businessmen in the at some point, sort of became more powerful in the church, or it may not have been Republican, because when they became a state, they just divided the population by lot, almost flipping a coin and saying, you're Democrats, you're Republican. So half the state was Democrat, half the state was Republican. But eventually that did die out or was killed off. So I think religion does not exclude socialism, as in liberation theology in Latin America. And in Oscar Romero, in his letters, he writes clearly from the roots of the Jewish prophets and their concern for the poor. And he's quoting them, and he gets assassinated for doing that and saying, if your military leader tells you to do something you think it's wrong, you don't have to obey that order. And within a week, he was killed. And so I think that it goes back to Dante, and does poverty have a lover? And that poverty hasn't had a lover for 1,000 years, that the church is more interested in power and money. And so I think the reason we have the separation of science, church and state here is because the churches were just devouring each other. And somebody mentioned the wars in the 15th, 16th century, and there's a great book called Kepler's Witch, which is about Kepler's mother, who he had to defend from a witch trial. And Kepler, that book really lays out how the Catholics are killing the Lutherans, but then the Lutherans start killing other Lutherans because they disagree on points on the communion. So, what brings the community together? And even, the Jewish scriptures have a lot of things that we don't hear about in the USA. Like every 50 years, it's like a game of Monopoly. They just sort of realigned all the money and property because some people got so rich and other people got so poor. They did the Jubilee, and they basically redistributed the wealth. That's at the root of Jewish and Christian scriptures, the realignment of wealth, but we don't hear about that much. So I think socialism is almost, or even a decent capitalism, unless it's inspired by some sense of stewardship, that the money's not yours, you're holding it for the community, and maybe the idea being you might know how better to use it than the people, but that's not always been the case.
Right.
Even Adam Smith says, give the tax breaks to the poor because they'll spend it. If you give it to the rich, they'll save it until they find a good investment, maybe in another country, that it's not going to go back into the society if you give the big breaks to the rich. I mean, that's Adam Smith who says that. So
Right. Yeah, he had a lot of interesting things to say about, besides just the free market.
Oh yeah.
What I was going to mention, Doug, is I think actually Dostoevsky had, towards the end of his life, or maybe in his later years, some similar conception of Christian socialism, or something along the lines of how to do socialism that's not based on like this sort of mechanistic, empirical, statistical, foundation, which may serve auxiliary purpose, like Shatov, going back to Shatov, may serve auxiliary purpose, but it cannot serve a foundational purpose of bringing people together to some sort of common denominator. I think that's what he was bemoaning, was this idea that somehow we can unite society by metric system. I mean, that is not something you build society on, or anything like that. Okay, who was next? Madeline, I believe you were next.
Well, this is fascinating. I'm in a philosophy meetup group, and we just got done discussing philanthropy in Judaism and the transition into early Christianity and philanthropy and almsgiving. And certainly we have, and also how the power of the local bishops before the whole papacy system got set up, how they had so much power because they were the ones who distributed the alms. And so that is kind of like that saint in this book, who I'm continually struck by. I don't know if Dostoevsky, at that point I thought Dostoevsky must be an atheist, but maybe he just was sort of pointing out the the oddness of God's gifts. So anyway, I think that Shatov and Kirillov, Dostoevsky, he keeps pairing them together for a reason. Like he talks about, first of all, they're sharing a house, but they don't speak. They don't want to be anywhere near each other. And the reason supposedly is because they had lain side by side in America. So I wonder, like, the two men, they had lain side by side. It has that sort of biblical, they had sex kind of sound to it. So at first I thought that might be the cause of why they didn't speak. But I'm wondering what America at that time looked like to Dostoevsky, like what Shatov's passionate social and kind of religious beliefs, how that would have been paired with Kirillov to produce something in America, like whether it would be democracy or the frontier mentality, because he could have had them go through a hard time anywhere, but he didn't. He had them come all the way over to another continent in order to do it. So it must have held some symbolic value for him to have these two linked together here. Any ideas, anyone?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think America at the time was the symbol of a new society, of this new society that's somewhat based on reason and science, and based on sort of this free market and kind of the utilitarian concepts of Adam Smith and you know, the ideas that, you know, we don't need any kind of sublime transcendental values to build society upon. We can just do, you know, it's just a matter of self-interest and science and technology. And America, I think, was the city on a hill in terms of showing the way to everyone else at the time how to do that. And of course, their description of it is somewhat, not, I would say, less than complimentary, because they're talking about how they were swindled willingly, but still swindled by these people that, you know, hired them. And you know, that it wasn't such a great society, perhaps, and perhaps there's other things in the world besides that, and you know, that they did not want perhaps to remodel Russia according to those principles. There's some prejudice there, I think, in Dostoevsky's description of their travels, and I'm not sure. I don't think he ever actually came to the United States himself, so he must be basing his experience on other people's impressions and sort of secondhand knowledge. So I wouldn't necessarily. Anyway, I'm not sure how much stock I would put in that, but I do think that it had its symbolic meaning, like you said, Madeline. I agree with you there. I think that sounds about right. Anyone else has any thoughts on that? On Shatov and Kirillov in the United States there. It's almost like, it sounds like, I'm trying to think. Yeah, Doug, go ahead.
I just read a line, it sort of pops up where somebody's talking about the kind of boldness of the Americans to explore all kinds of stuff. And I'm not sure it was always good stuff, but there was a boldness there in breaking, I can't remember where it was. But there seemed to be some idea that America, you didn't have to destroy as much, because it was a virgin, well, we did destroy a lot when we came here, but it was a virgin land, so they could create a new, you know. I've gone back to look at Robert Frost's The Gift Outright, and it's really kind of creepy when you really look at the whole history of America and the gift, and becoming the land before the land becomes you or something. I was a weird sort of thing there, but it sort of fascinates me, this whole, which you see in various political systems, the land and God and the land and blood and the land of, and it manifests in sometimes very virulent, and I think that comes from the Bible too. Before the Jewish prophets, you have the God that tells the Jewish people what to do. You know, they don't question. The Jewish prophets question God. They negotiate with God. There's a guy who teaches negotiation at Harvard, and he starts with the Jewish prophets. Like, you know, if I find 100 good people, will you not destroy the city? Well, I can't find 100. What if I find 10? What if I find one?
Well,
And
that's
God
Abraham,
says,
so
okay,
that's
find
before the
one. And
prophets.
they end up kicking him out of the city and he destroys the city anyway. But it's like, it's a negotiation with God. And,
Yes.
but the promised land is taken over by saying, go in there and kill every man, woman, child, and living beast that breathes, just clean
I
it
mean, if
out
there
and
was
take it over.
if Hitler needed a justification for invading the entire Europe and Russia, you can't find a better one than that, right?
Well, George Steiner's written a book called The Portage of A.H. from San Cristobal. And actually, they find Hitler in the jungle, bring him out, put him on trial, and he actually quotes that section of the Bible in justification for what he does, written
Yeah,
by
makes sense
George
to me.
Steiner,
Yeah.
a Jew.
Promised land.
And the Manifest Destiny, certainly, we did that here. And I have read, and I don't have this confirmed, that even the concentration camps that Hitler did were based on the Native American reservations here.
I think, well, either that, I think actually they were prototyped on the English concentration camps in Africa during the Boer War. Well, it wasn't during, but preceding to that, I think, or maybe either right.
Yeah, no, that's possible too.
Yeah, I think that was the.
Or in India or various.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a good history there. All right, let's move along to the next person, Stavrogin, the central character that we all love and hate at the same time. One of the favorite quotes I have is a short one. In order to have a rabbit sauce, you need a rabbit. In order to believe in God, you need God. I think that's probably my favorite one that I like, very succinct and to the point, where of course he doubts God's existence, talking to Shatov, whom we just discussed, and when Shatov, makes this big case for every people need a certain, their existence really is predicated on the search for God. Then he asks him, do you believe in God? And I think CJ put that quote in there. I shall believe in God. So he's not even sure himself, but he's looking for it. And then he says, well, your rabbit must still be running around in the woods. Have you caught it? Do you guys have any good quotes from Stavrogin? He actually doesn't say a whole lot. He does a lot of things, but he doesn't say a whole lot except for in his confession. Maybe, do you guys have any good quotes from there or from any other passages?
I don't have a quote so much as the most revealing things about him is when somebody says something to him and their insight into him shocks him and he just almost goes silent and runs away. He says, oh, he's clearly intelligent. He can explore a lot of things, but then people see through him. I think Dasha does at one point and Tikhon does, and it terrifies him.
Yeah. I have one that is taken from his confession, and he says basically, every situation in my life in which I have ever happened to find myself, however unspeakably shameful, utterly degrading, vile, and most importantly ridiculous, has always aroused both boundless anger and unbelievable pleasure in me. Precisely the same also has been true in moments when I was committing a crime and in moments when my life was in danger. If I was stealing something, then while I was perpetrating the theft, my awareness of the depth of my violence would send me into ecstasy. It was not vileness that I loved, but rather the ecstasy I derived from the tormenting awareness of having fallen so low that was so gratifying. So this is almost terrifying confession of, and I don't know how many of us can really identify with that. This idea that committing the most vile act you can think of is gratifying, but maybe we need to exercise our imagination. I don't know. Any thoughts on that aspect of? Madeline, go ahead.
Yeah, I just thought I would reiterate again. I think he is a sadist, and that explains I don't know why people become sadists, but that does explain all that high and low and infliction of pain. And now he's degraded, all of that that he sees, and he's very charismatic. People want to follow him.
Okay. I guess I'm curious, like, yeah, you did mention that, like, how do people become that though? What went wrong? You know, he is such a, he is a person of enormous potential. It's obvious. He's educated, good looking, he is intelligent, he is smart, he has the will, the charisma. What is wrong with him? Why does he become the way, what is, like, we
Good
start?
question.
Yeah. Allison, do you have any thoughts on any of this?
Yeah, that was the quote that's really like struck me the most, probably from the entire book. I don't know that I think sometimes, you know, you can look at childhood things, but I think sometimes literally nothing goes wrong and somebody's just wired like that. I do, because sometimes you look at and it's like, you know, like the bad seed, you know, there's that play, bad seed. I think sometimes people just like pop out like that and there's no, you know, but sometimes when you look at like Hitler or, you know, there's all sorts of people who've done these really, really horrendous things. And you think, how, why, you know, but they must get some kind of joy from it. So I felt like that scene really like epitomized it.
I struggle, you know, I struggle with this thing, with just writing him off as, oh, he's a sadist, because what that means is we don't have to look inside, you know, oh, he's that, but, you know, we're not sadists, so we can just keep going. I'm curious how, if there is a turning point, if there's a series of some sort of decisions in life that you make, maybe they're not well, they got to be semi-conscious at least, where you make a sort of wrong turn and you keep making that wrong turn. I don't know. Maybe, you know, the conversation with Tikhon comes to mind, where Tikhon says, you know, you have to kind of humble yourself and stop doing everything for an act, a show of how strong you are and how, you know, you want to be seen as this or that or the other thing. And you need to, you know, and that's how you will overcome your demon. And I think Dasha also mentions that, you know, that there's a demon inside that he's letting it dominate him. Maybe it's this anger and sense of pleasure that is overwhelming him or something else. And I think at every step he is yielding to that desire. He's not in any way overcoming. He is yielding to that moment by moment, and then eventually it just leads him to this point realization that, okay, like I have nothing else to experience, to offer, to do. And he says at the end there, and this is in his letter that he writes just before he dies, he kills himself. I have always been capable of wanting to do a great deed and take pleasure in this. At the same time, I want evil as well, and I also feel pleasure. But both feelings are too shallow. As always before, they're never enough. My desires are too weak. They can't guide me. You can cross a river on a log, but not on a chip of wood. And of course, the next thing we know is he hangs himself. And I think this is the tragedy of his life, is the person who has so much to offer himself and others, who like loses that desire. Kirillov is the opposite in some ways. He dies because of the abundance of desire, but Stavrogin, with all his energy, with all his charisma, with all of his upbringing, and he's like the aristocracy. He almost reminds me of some of Scott Fitzgerald's characters, like the aristocracy that doesn't know what to do with everything they have. Like they have everything, and yet they are depressed and they don't know like what to do with their lives, even though they could do anything. It's almost like that feeling of I'm not sure, some kind of defect of will or motive. I don't know. Let's see, Madeline. Wait, let me see here. Who? Yes, Jeannie, Madeline, and Jeannie again. Twice, Jeannie, you get twice. Once, well, anyway, go ahead, Jeannie.
Well, I think Dostoevsky purposefully has the two generations. And as the first generation is atheist, then it necessarily means that that second generation is screwed up. And I think there's a lot more than that. You know, it's not just, you know, atheism versus non, but, you know, I feel so much like my generation really failed to stop, you know, what we knew was happening at that time. And, you know, we were thinking, oh, peace and love, kind of like Berkovensky, eh? And then ends up, you know, we were way off the ball. You know, nothing we did really even made us a bit of difference. And I feel like that's how he's setting it up, as this first generation has really somehow, you know, they have some kind of good ideas, or, you know, well-meaning, and, you know, they're really nice people or whatever, but they just absolutely failed the next generation, and they didn't prepare them. They didn't give them meaning in their lives. And that's I think he's pointing that out pretty strongly.
I absolutely agree with you. I absolutely agree with that. There's definitely that very strong point coming. Both, it's a, in some ways, it's a very pointed reprimand to Stepan Trofimovich Verkovensky and Varvara and Yulia and von Lemkin. All of these, like you're saying, the older generation, they have all failed in different ways. They've all, they've all failed. That's almost the, there's your Russian novel, everybody fails. No happy end at all. Okay, who was next? Let's see, Madeline.
Well, let's see. So Fitzgerald, I always have read The Great Gatsby not as a great love story, but as a novel about class issues in America. We have this sort of supercilious, upper middle class Protestant narrator who is looking down his nose at Gatsby. He's semi-chaperoning his cousin, but not really doing a very good job of it. There's a girl he likes. He turns her down eventually because he has heard that she cheated at golf by moving the ball. So it's actually a very judgmental novel about new money, as opposed to, you know, money that is earned steadily and conserved over generations, and how new money is so often involved with criminal gangs. And I think that in this book, Demons, that I think Nikolai Stavrogin, he's like the shadow side of the aristocracy. He has a very old demon in him, and it's a very old demon of BSC of cruelty. So his mother is more like the better side. She conserves her land. She, after the peasants are liberated, she tries to care for those who were basically formerly her possessions. She educates them. She wants to help them. She wants to give Shatov money. And so his sadism is like the dark side of a very ancient, I guess, Russian aristocracy. It says, you know, other people's lives are mine to play with, and I can dominate, and I can be cruel, and I can get away with it because I have money and I look dashing on a horse, and I have a place in society that these other people don't have.
Right.
And again, I think that he chose his wife really as part of that underlying sadism or psychopathy, that she was someone who just could not, she was as low as you could get. It was like having sex with a little girl. Right. Or, and first basically gaslighting her by letting her be accused of a crime she didn't commit and then not speaking up, which was also horrible. That his wife was sort of the other side of it in the sense that people living in those conditions they're in those conditions because people like Stavrogan created them. All those generations of the, the harsh, sort of dark shadow side of the aristocracy created all of that.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's good analysis, I think.
And it doesn't speak to his individual psychology. And I do agree with Allison, sometimes people are just born that way. It's just sort of how they are.
Right.
Yeah, that's a tough one for us to accept, right? In our liberal society, that we think everybody can be rescued, but I guess some people can be rescued. Maybe he's one of those people that that just can't be rescued. All right, I want to switch to the women in the book. So far we've had men only, quotes from men, but I want to switch to Maria Libatkina, which probably is a good segue because we're talking about Stavrogan. And does anybody have any good quotes from Maria, or any passages that you'd like that were memorable to you, or you want to quote or maybe talk about? Allison, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just I had raised my hand about Stavrogan. I was thinking that, like, when we look at certain family, like the Kennedys, for example, everything they've done some pretty awful things, a few of them. And we just, like the one that was accused of rape, and the, what is the woman, when she went over the bridge and then he ran away, but we all would just act like, oh, boys will be boys. And, like, I mean, I feel like that's kind of like Stavrogan's thing. It's like, he started out with little things and it was always sort of excused, and then it just gets bigger and bigger and worse and worse and worse. And then it's always like sort of okay if you're rich. It's like, you're not crazy or eccentric. And it's just sort of like, whereas if you're poor, you're in jail immediately. You know what I mean? And so I think it's that kind of thing. And then it gets worse and worse. Yeah.
All right, so going back to Maria Libatkina, my favorite passage is when I guess probably the last time we hear from her is when she talks to Stavrogan when he visits her and her brother, and she asks him to walk outside and come in again because she's not sure that he is the prince that she married. And when he walks back in, she says, "No, you're not. You're some owl." She calls him an owl. He says, "You're not a falcon. And a falcon, I guess, in Russian sort of mythology is kind of like this, like an eagle. American mythology, right? It's this bird of honor and nobility. But an owl is this bird associated with the devil, with night, with craftiness." And she says, "You're not the prince. And I'm not afraid of your knife." And I mean, she lets him have it. She tells him, "No, I'm not going to go to Switzerland with you. And who are you to even think that somehow, you think that I'm just going to, I'm not even a human being, that, just because you're rich or whatever, I'm just going to drop everything and go with you to some place to live on the mountain for 40 years. And, it's just amazing, the spirit that she has. And I wonder if really she is, there's some indication that she might be mentally ill, but at the same time, the way she speaks and the way she treats him and talks back to him, she seems like completely in control of her faculties. What do you guys think about this passage? Did you have any sort of a response to that last conversation, or Maritza, go ahead.
I think she was interested, some of her phrases that she was given to say, they made more sense to me after you mentioned a few weeks back that, I think it was you, maybe someone else, mentioned that in Russia, people with a disability are viewed as like special or transcendental, and so it made me view many of her passages in a different light. And I feel like she's the one that Dostoevsky designated to be like the illuminator of the demons, as it were, because she says these things that seem like off the cuff, but they're like stark. Like, I mean, just that, the whole like, you're not my prince. And she's saying that to the one man that is like the, you know, he's the distinguished gentleman, but it's very much a facade.
Right.
And she inerrantly sees that. She's got this, she's having a conversation with Shatov, and she's talking about the great mother, I believe it's, you know, the mother of God. And it's just, what she's saying is so, it seemed like super profound. You know, she says, you know, she's like, what is the mother of God? What do you think? The great mother, I answer, the hope of the human race. And, you know, it's interesting because she says that she says the word sank into my heart at the time. And I wonder if somehow that aspect there is, maybe it's a subtle interweaving of all the, you know, if Dostoevsky's overarching point, because, you know, like I said, I've mentioned before, I view this to be a very religious novel. And even not that the novel itself is religious, but the undertone of the novel is very religious in nature. And there's certainly a moral certainty that Dostoevsky would like the reader to come away with. And so to my view, this line is like a beautiful, it's like another side of the coin of saying, you know, if you have and because Shatov is the one he's the one who constantly struggling with the crises of faith. And I feel like, you know, the shiner of the one who shines the light upon demons is saying to him, if you're struggling so much with God the Father, maybe try to embrace the mother, and that's another path for you. But I don't know, that's just my 2 cents on that one.
No, that's interesting. That's interesting. Here's a thought I had about this when I was rereading this. You know, she says, okay, you're not my prince. But did she ever think that he was, and maybe he was at some point, a person who still had a chance to become that? And maybe when she married him, or at least gave some sort of consent to all of this, there was a, you know, he still had a chance, and then he betrayed it. And he was no longer that person that was redeemable. I'm just curious if any of you think that's a possibility. Because, you know, why did she suddenly tell him, like, you know, I mean, if she always knew that, then why did she, you know, agree to even marry him? But it sounds like she did initially. So maybe there was some kind of, again, turning point that he went past, and that was it. At that point, there was no return from that. And she tells him, you are an imposter. And she says, anathema, right? Anathema, comparing him to this character who was an imposter prince, in fact, right? During, I think it was right after Ivan the Terrible's death, there were like these people who were claimed to be one of his sons, and this is one of them. And so she calls him that. It says anathema, meaning, of course, you're cursed. So anyway, it's a curious, interesting passage there. Doug.
I think she is, the Tarkovsky movie I put down there, it has an interesting holy fool character. And I kept, as soon as I read this, I started to project that character a little. She's even more of a fool in the movie, and an innocent and very squirrely, but they're all intuitive, and they sort of like, almost like animals do. They sense whether somebody can be trusted or not. And then it seems like it must be something in the body state that he brings into the room where his strategy has changed. So he's no longer kind of everybody's treating her like she's silly, and he gives her gentleness. And then once he's moving in a new direction and has other plans in the works, he comes in without that sense of warmth towards her. There's something clearly in the body state with her that is shifted, and she reads that, or she's just intuitive and senses, you know, his guilt and his own anxiety. And I think that's all threaded in with when he's meeting Fedka. And so she's very, but I haven't made my peace with that. But I've been wrestling with that same thing. Even this morning, reading the Camus adaptation, is what flips her. And because it's immediate and it's like dramatic and it's like.
There is a special word for this in Russian language when you have some sort of disfigurement or disease, whether it's a mental disease or physical. It's there's a word for it, urodivy, which means, well, I mean, typically it means just a mad person, but it carries over to the physical ailments as well. And the idea is this, at least it was kind of believed until maybe like a couple of hundred years ago, that a person who has this awful disfigurement is somehow marked by God. And it's not just a disease, it's almost like a gift, ironically, right? It's a gift that you have because you have this gift of suffering, and therefore you have, because God has given this to you to suffer, like let's say maybe you can't walk or whatever, you have the special sort of communication channel with God, and therefore other people are supposed to first of all give you alms because of that, but secondly they're supposed to listen, people would listen to them because, like you're saying, they have some sort of clarity and some sort of premonitions about the future or the real, they can see past the facade. And so Maria Lebedkin in some ways is kind of like that. She has, she's limping, she has a disfigurement, and she also appears to be kind of like this mad person. Sometimes she says things that don't make any sense, but then other times she makes perfect sense. Yeah, she is interesting. But at the same time, Dostoevsky, again, he gives her this, he treats her as a human being. And she has this dignity that she displays just before she's murdered, brutally murdered by this whole demonic plot. She comes out and she's very bold. She's not afraid. She knows what's coming. She sees it basically, that she's about to die. She's about to be killed. She doesn't do anything about it, just like Shatov in some ways, like a lamb to the slaughter, basically. And yeah, it's almost like Kirillov in some ways, right? She's fully in control. She doesn't kill herself, but she is not avoiding it either. Oh, urodivy? Yes, I can write that.
On the idea of the disability or the malformity, or that, I think that's why that short line at the end where they say there were no signs that he was insane is probably because he was very handsome in death, so he couldn't have been insane. I mean, that's finally triggered that, the doctors, that's when people were studying skull formations,
Yeah,
and all this stuff to tell
Phrenology,
whether somebody was
yes.
good or not. So, the doctors declare he's completely sane.
Yes, yes.
But to return to his character,
they analyze his liver, yeah.
and his sadism, I think it has to do a lot with the kind of upbringing he had, not so much from his mother, but from his teacher, Stepan, and that he would wake him up in the middle of the night and they'd be crying together about Stepan's sufferings. And it's like, if it's not actually a sort of a surrogate incest, it's an emotional incesting of him, of Nikolai. And there's a lot of hints of that people give it too much attention to children, or it's the wrong kind of attention, or it's something. And that vacancy, I mean, like Stepan completely neglected his own son and then gave almost too much emotional weight to his surrogate son. And both of them are kind of confused.
Yeah, absolutely. He bears
based on his frustration of his relationship, but his worship of the West and philosophy and posing and all of this. And,
Right. No, absolutely. Okay, moving on, since we are short on time, I want to definitely cover another bright and interesting character, Lisa Tushina, Елизавета Николаевна Tushina, Lisa. And I have a couple of passages I want to read, and maybe that will spur you to share some of your favorites as well. My favorite, of course, is the one where just after the night together with Stavrogin, and they have this conversation, and she says, "Are you undertaking to count the puzzling things I say?" She laughed. "But do you remember that when I came in yesterday, I said I was a dead woman, and you found it necessary to forget it or not to notice? I don't remember, Lisa, why a dead woman? We must live. And you had nothing to say? You've completely lost your eloquence. I've lived my time on this earth, and that's enough. Do you remember Christopher Ivanovich? No, I don't," he frowned. "Christopher Ivanovich in Lausanne. You found him a dreadful bore. He would open your door and always say, 'I'm here for just a minute,' and then he'd stay all day. I don't want to be like Christopher Ivanovich and stay all day." I thought that was such a amazing way to put it, because we all know people like that, right? Like Christopher, who come in and say, I'm just going to drop in for like 2 minutes, and they stay on. And she says, "I don't want to overstay my visit here. I'm here for a minute and I'm leaving. I'm a dead woman." And I mean, she is just, what a character, right? Curious if anyone wants to weigh in on this. Madeline, go ahead.
Well, she was a very minor character. We never really find out what's going on with her. I believe they do say that she's ill in some way. They don't say what it is, but she's doing the horseback riding for her health, and her face is pale, or it's flushed, or it's something. So she has her own little mini tragedy going. There's the part where she fantasizes about having a broken leg so that Mavriki Nikolaevich will tend to her. And she does I think I said this at a previous meeting, she does show some signs of personal agency in her idea for compiling the Russian Annual Chronicle. And she has taken the initiative to try to get Shatov to print it. And she says, I have this idea and I have the money. So she's sort of the love interest between Mavriki Nikolaevich and Nikolai Stavrogin. She's riding around. She's the angel on horseback to Stepan Trofimovich when she first appears. And yet at the same time, there is some spark of something in her that's there. Very briefly, unfortunately, because she too was killed, like everyone. So there was that one slightly interesting aspect to her, I thought.
I want to comment on that, man. I want to push back a little bit, in my opinion, obviously, but I don't take this idea with Shatov at face value at all. I don't think she was after doing anything along those lines. I think it was a kind of a pretense move to get him to tell her something about Stavrogin. And it wasn't something like she was interested in peasant anything. I feel like she was this, to me, when I read about her and her this idea of living for a moment, it's a very romantic ideal, right? It's a very like a romantic in a sense, not love romantic, but in a sense of like 19th century romanticism, where it's all about passion and mystery and this kind of emotional something deep inside of us, completely impractical, almost a reaction to the industrialization and rationalization, as romantic movement was a reaction to that. And it's everything anti-reason, everything that's anti-predictability and status quo, and let's get married and have kids and doing the rational thing. It's anti-Jane Austen, I would say, kind of anti-respectability. And at the same time, she is a very interesting young girl, very spirited young girl who, if you remember, drops on her knees before this icon and takes something off of her, neck, some very expensive jewelry, and just gives it away. And she is kind of very, I can't quite peg her. I don't know if she's sick. I don't know if she's ill. I think she is one of those people that have been raised on French romance novels of the time, and kind of, Georges Sand and who I'm trying to think of, Stendhal, and some of these other romantic, tragic novels where, the main heroine has to die, and she wants to experience that. She doesn't want to stay for the whole day, and that's why I like this passage, because she puts it so succinctly. She says, I don't want to stay the whole day. I don't want to get old. And I don't want to you're not going to be able to give me the kind of life I'm interested in. So I'm gone. I'm a dead woman. And that's why, she goes into the most dangerous spot and gets killed, almost fulfilling her wish. Does anybody else have any other opinions? I'm just blabbing on here, but I'm curious if you guys have other thoughts. Ginny.
Well, I think for Dostoevsky, she represents the liberated woman. And I think it's not anything really she says, but riding around on a horse, absolutely scandalous. It's like me riding around on my bicycle. And it's something that needs to be, that's why he has to kill her, because she just is the wrong thing. He just disagrees with that. And that's why I think he kills her.
Kira, do you want to tell us a few things? Because you keep putting there in chat, but maybe don't be shy. Come on. I'm sure you would love to hear kind of your interpretation of all of this. No? Or is your mic working? No, not working.
She doesn't want to be on camera. Maybe go to Maritza.
Okay, no problem. Sorry to put you on the spot. Well, she's on camera, but it's not silent partner. Yes. Okay, Maritza, go ahead.
No, I just want to point out that, and this is a entirely fleshed out idea, but Lisaveta she's willing to run away with Stavrogan, but then after spending the night with him, she sees clearly that he doesn't actually love her. And I'm thinking there's not very many women characters in this book, and that's the two that got close to Stavrogan see him for the fraud that he is,
Mm-hmm.
and don't let him get away with it. And I just thought that was interesting.
Mm. Yeah, no, she definitely, yeah, I loved how she started pushing back as soon as he started questioning her love, or like, why did you give me so much happiness? You're like, what are you talking about? You're the most selfish person. Like, he didn't know what this was all about. And now you expect some sort of like, the only reason you're disappointed is because I rejected you before you rejected me, essentially. But it's more than that. I feel like when she talks about this idea that, and this is another quote from her, I burned myself on a candle, nothing more. Listen, I already told you, I've given my life in exchange for just 1 hour, and I'm at peace. I actually think that she is very much like Kirillov in some ways, that she is exercising her self-will just without the philosophical underpinnings, just saying, look, I want to be on my terms, I want to live life on my terms. And that means that if I'm good for this one moment, that is all I need. I'm not going to overstay my visit. And that's a very, interesting person, I think, who can say that. And then, of course, and Dostoevsky, he loves these kinds of characters, the ones that are extreme, because he himself was extreme in many ways. One of the things he hated was mediocrity. He never wanted the golden middle. He despised the golden middle. He always and that's, I think, a very Russian quality as well, for good or for bad. Very extreme, one to the other, right? Capitalism, socialism, right? Communism, or absolute monarchy, and just.
What's nice, I mean, a good author, he's providing us a very clear vision of the ideal, because usually the ideal is not somebody we as mere humans could actually, be, but that's always the goal, right? We want to be quite that idealistic.
Mm-hmm.
I really like that.
Mm-hmm. All right. If there is nothing else on Elizaveta, should we go to Varvara Petrovna Stavrogina, the patroness extraordinaire? You know, the love, the lifelong lifelong love and admiration of Stepan Trofimovich, and the person who is right there there with us to the end. She's right there in the beginning and right there at the end. She kind of is the one of the people that everything kind of revolves around in some ways. She doesn't do a whole lot, but she's the background to this drama, to this tragedy that unfolds before us. One of my favorite lines that she gives is when she is coaching Stepan Trofimovich for this ball, for this festivity that's about to come. And she says, and of course, it's also a goodbye. You know, she wants to finalize their relationship and say everything that she's been thinking for 20 years. And she says, "You're awfully partial to exclamations, Stepan Trofimovich. That's utterly out of fashion these days. People speak rudely, but simply. These 20 years have become an obsession of yours. 20 years of mutual vanity and nothing more. Every letter of yours was written not to me, but for posterity. You're a stylist, not a friend. While friendship is only a glorified word, in essence, a mutual outpouring of slops." And and then she talks about, you know, Stepan Trofimovich says something about talking about the eternal beauty of the Sistine Madonna, and she says, "This jug is useful because you can pour water into it. This pencil is useful because you can write everything down with it. But there's a female face that's uglier than all of the faces in nature. Try to draw an apple and place it beside a real apple. Which would you take? I dare say you would make a mistake." So she is a sort of pragmatic woman and very, I guess, practical and critical of these high theories and high ideals and so forth. What do you guys think about her, and what's the thing that you, I guess, you take away from this book, from this novel on her? Nobody? I thought surely somebody would love to talk about Varvara Petrovna.
Jeannie?
Jeannie, go ahead. Sure.
Well, I think in her case, I mean, it's a perfect example of somebody who is kind and well-meaning and even thoughtful and all this, yet absolutely powerless. She can't even save her own son. She can't, I mean, she's just, well, I don't know. That's all I can say, powerless.
Kira, go ahead.
I don't know how this fits in the theme of demons, but I feel like Varvara Petrovna and also the new mayor's wife, whose name I can't remember,
Yulia.
both of them are so easily swayed by external social forces that they're not able to hold on to their own direction. So in Varvara's case, she has this deep affinity with Stepan over decades and can't even recognize it until the very end. And even though it was something that she initiated herself, in just a short period of time of Pyotr's influence, she loses that connection that is true to herself and forsakes him.
Mm-hmm.
And I in her case, I can see that she is led astray by the demons of the next generation. I mean, you could look at it that way. I'm not sure if that's entirely intentional, but she's, you know, that's the effect of the demons on her in that she loses her own convictions. I don't know if that's quite the same with the new mayor's wife, because I'm not sure that she necessarily had any to begin with.
To begin with, right. That's I agree with that. Yeah, that's probably a good description of what's happening. Let's see, who do we have? Allison, and then Madeline.
I thinking about what Doug said, like at the very beginning about Varvara, is like these old ladies of Pasadena, where they were like the ones who in charge of all the cultural things. And I feel like that's the thing, it just keeps resonating with me, that there's always these women in these different, every big city has them, and they're the ones that support the opera and the orchestra and the museums, and they sort of run everything behind the scenes. And I feel like she's like, I actually just love her character. I really do, because I feel like, she really means so well. And she is, sometimes maybe she's a little clueless, but she just takes in all the strays and takes care of everyone. And yes, she has all the serfs, she is of that class, but at the same time, she really is trying to take care of literally every person in her world. And so I think she's very admirable. And even just having her salon so everyone can talk about ideas. I mean, honestly, Shrikant's just like a little bit like that with 52 Living Ideas, and it's in Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society is basically a salon. So it's kind of a similar idea, but I don't know. I just think she's a great character.
She strikes me as this woman. There's a famous poem by Nekrasov about a woman who can walk into a burning building or a burning house, and she strikes me as that type of person. She has this amazing, commanding presence. Remember when she walks in, finds Stepan Trofimovich, who is like fleeing from everything, from reality, and she starts ordering everybody around, and even the people that are owners of that inn or whatever, they get scared because, I mean, she is general's wife, so she has this sort of amazing commanding presence. And definitely, and it's interesting to contrast that with Yulia Mikhailovna von Lemke, the governor's wife. She doesn't really have that presence at all. She's very unsure of herself, so she aligns herself with Pyotr and feels completely out of place and unsure of herself when Pyotr like throws her overboard. And what a difference, right? And I agree with Kira's statement that probably Yulia doesn't really have beliefs of her own. She's just ready to adopt anything that's popular and anything that's sort of like in vogue at the moment. And as soon as that changes, she's useless. Versus Varvara Petrovna, who is very she has her feet on the ground, and she's very practical, and she knows exactly what needs to be done. Not always. She's very sure of herself. But that's also her, the trouble with her. She thinks she's too sure, and she's too. I guess in some ways she doesn't really see the big picture.
She's sort of like the one family member who holds together all of the holidays and everything. And when that family member dies, none of the cousins see any cousins anymore, and everything falls apart because that one person, passed away. But she's that one. She's the glue holding the entire thing together. Yeah.
Right, for sure. Madeline and then Doug.
Yes, I like the point about how quickly she turned on Stepan Trofimovich. It was very disturbing. And the thing, that's kind of what made his son so evil, was that these were things that, as the reader, I could see them all from the very beginning. I could see that, one aspect of their relationship, yes, you could see it as he was sponging off her and, didn't give her intellectual due, or, whatever it was. So in a way, it sort of points up that this take charge woman also lives in a dream world. That's a sort of world of two of her and Stepan Trofimovich. And that because she never looked at the whole thing, once the fantasy aspect is shattered, she just goes over to the other side of it. She never really, until the end of the book, she never gets an integrated view of it. It's always kind of one thing or another. And that seems to be the real evil that that Stepan's son does is that he's not just puncturing people's fantasies. Well, he also lies. He hides things. He denigrates people's creative work. Yeah, he's all around a bad guy. But I think that for her, she is that kind of take charge woman. If she'd been a man, she would probably be a general or a mayor or something. And if you're around her, your life is going to be organized for you. There's no two ways about it. And it just depends if you want that or not, what your response is going to be.
Absolutely. Yeah,
But she does always mean well. She's not doing any of it cruelly, except for she has that rivalry with her childhood friend, and she wants her son to marry well, so she's manipulating the hell out of the situation to get Daria out of the way and married to Stepan, so that leaves her son free to marry Lizaveta, blah, blah, blah. But
it's a fine line. It's a fine line.
She basically means well with everything.
Yeah. But she is manipulative, and it's a fine line where that care ends and the manipulation starts. Doug.
I just wanted to, am I unmuted? Expand a little on what Allison said. A lot of that happened in San Diego, where there were widows of like Ray Kroc, who was very right-wing conservative, militaristic, founder of McDonald's. And he died young. And a lot of this was a pattern in San Diego where these sort of patriarchy, sometimes conservative, sometimes not so conservative, but mostly conservative, and their widows would completely change track in the spending of their money. Like Joan Kroc started the Center for Peace in San Diego, and which was totally counter and was giving to all kinds of things that Ray Kroc never paid any attention to, the arts and a whole range of cultural issues. And I think Maureen O'Connor became the mayor, and she was married to the founder of Jack in the Box. And there were all these people who did very progressive things. So I think it was Maureen O'Connor later in life suddenly turned to gambling, which was strange, sort of Dostoevskian turn. And then there's a third one. Well, there's Jackie Littlefield, who ran a theater, but these women, and Ted Geisel's widow, Dr. Seuss's widow, she pretty much funded the rebuilding of the Old Globe Theater after it built down. And I think Ted Geisel was maybe alive, maybe not, right about that time, but she was one of the cornerstones in arts funding in San Diego. So, and if you could get those people to your galas, you'd get everybody else in town to your galas.
Right. Right, for sure.
So she reminds me of that character. Very capable women. There's a woman named Darlene Shiley. You'll see her name on a lot of PBS funding, and she's out of San Diego. And she and her husband actually funded a lot of arts things. And then when he died, she has continued it, but they were more on the same page. But you'll see her name pop up in the funding of all kinds of PBS programming.
Thank you, Doug. I have a couple more people that I thought we might revisit, but I think we're running out of time, so I don't want to impose on your time. So maybe what would be good in the last 10 or 15 minutes or so is just some thoughts on the overall themes and I guess theses of the book that you thought were important, memorable to you, made some sort of mark. I guess the other thought is, I always keep thinking, when I read something, am I letting whatever I'm reading change me in some way? Because a lot of times we try to, instead of letting the text work with us, we make it fit within our preconceived sort of, we already believe certain things, so we find what we're looking for, as opposed to letting the text actually challenge some of our beliefs and notions. So with that as a context, anybody want to share any overarching themes that maybe have shocked you or maybe not? I don't know. So I'm just going to open it up to anybody who wants to share along those lines. Doug, go ahead.
only have one quick thought. Early on, I said reading Dostoevsky usually infects my dream life, and that hasn't happened so much. But what has happened is I feel the madness of this book has infected the world around me. It's like I'm not dreaming. It's like the world has turned into a nightmare state while I'm reading this book. So that's
I hope the
that's my
demons
main
don't-
thought from the whole.
Yeah, let's keep the demons in the book.
How do we put them back in the book? And
Yeah, but I agree. When we started the or when we were planning this reading, of course we had no idea, of the current events in Russia and Ukraine. And as much as I don't like to get into politics, and I try to stay away from current events just because it opens up a kind of a can of worms that I don't want to fall into. But at the same time, I feel like, what we're reading has direct bearing on this idea of violence. And, we started talking about this national trauma that is not resolved and how it works itself out into the, how it manifests itself in real life. And oh my gosh, if there is a manifestation of that right now in so many ways. I mean, Stepan Trofimovich, before he dies, he says, Russia is a sick man, and all these what he calls them, like sores, all these sores are festering, and they're coming to the surface, and they are manifesting themselves into these demons that are then possessing people like ourselves. And he puts himself right there with those people that are being possessed. And it says, we then go off the hill and drown as we deserve to. And if that is not happening right now in Russia and in maybe other parts of the world to a lesser extent, but I don't know, because that is the manifestation of this novel, of the demons that and the destruction and of what's happening. So yeah, Doug, I agree with you that this madness, unfortunately, is spilling over from this book into real life. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that. CJ, go ahead. You're muted, CJ.
I'm sorry.
The copy we're reading is my brother's from when he was in high school. And so I asked him about it. He has in the back, he checked off all these Dostoevsky books that he'd read. So I saw he had read most of them, which I hadn't done. And he said, yeah, my childhood was, or teenhood was very dark. And it was probably because of Dostoevsky. And he read so much of it.
Yeah, he has that effect, unfortunately. I have to agree.
I had some general remarks. One thing that really struck me throughout the whole novel was the literary criticism. That's very similar to Dante. In Dante, we have literary criticism. And here Dostoevsky's commenting on other authors almost, well, frequently.
Yeah.
There's a lot of cultural history and social history. Like Dante, I kept looking up in Wikipedia, is this someone I'm supposed to know? And when you know it's someone who was prominent in the 1800s that I didn't know anything about. There was a chat on psychoanalysis, and I found the history of psychology as an interesting tangent I went on. There are comments between, I think is it Chadov and Stavrogin? I'm not placing it, where are you psychoanalyzing me, or are you my analyst and whatnot? And so I looked it up, and in, what was it? In the 1859, I can't remember now. The first psychiatric hospital in St. Petersburg, and yet the novel, 1871, is 10 years before Freud goes to college. So psychology and psychiatry was an emerging big thing that Dostoevsky's commenting on in the era before Freud. So it's a wonderful social commentary on the history of psychology, this novel, I find. But a lot of interpretation requires you to know the history. So you can read a novel and then go to encyclopedias and other secondary sources and try to understand the cultural and social background, who the characters, the novelists, the politicians that are referenced, and then bring that into the novel if you didn't know it, or if you knew it because you grew up in that era. And so of course you know all the prominent politicians from France. And the novel, you can just read it from beginning to end, knowing all that cultural history. You know, it's a different experience. For me, not knowing much of the cultural history and not having time to thoroughly research it as I went through, the main theme, the main plot of the novel with this political theme and the Russian nihilist movement and the assassination it's based on, you know, that I just didn't have the knowledge, so that didn't really register very well with me. And I sort of missed it. I would have to, you know, I wonder what kind of understanding of Russian political history I'd need so that I could read this and feel that theme in it. For me, I didn't feel that theme. Instead, what I was grabbing was this narrator, Anton Gavarov, and just the fascinating, for me, demons that come out of the testimony an individual gives. Is Gavarov, it doesn't seem like it's police testimony. He's not reporting to the authorities his side of the story. It seems as though he's written this, the best I can figure, as a attempt to clear Stepan Verkovensky's name and character at the end. And that seems to justify why the ending story with Verkovensky is there, because I'm trying to explain the great man, or this is my imagination of what Gavarov's about. And yet, so much of the novel, Gavarov takes the God's eye view, goes into the mind of a character who's soon killed. There's no way he could know exactly what happened at the moment of these things going down, because everyone's dead or left town, or, you know, yet as the provider of testimony, I imagine and fill in and invent what happened and write this story out. And so for me, my theme for the novel, what it meant for me was just the whole issue of how to explain to others the little trouble from our little town, so that my mentor, Stepan Verkovensky, will be seen in a positive light, unlike some of these rumors that, and so that's more of a social interpretation. But it's what I was able to come up with on my first reading without the sort of political history knowledge that would have made what I understand Dostoevsky, you know, in our copy, which is the Andrew McAndrew edition, at the very end, there's a chapter on all the political history. So I read the whole novel and I get to this last chapter, and it's describing all these assassinations and all this political movement as if this chapter is going to explain the book to me. And I couldn't get through it. I just like, this seems to be tangential to the world of the novel I just read. Why do they talk about all this stuff? And then I realized, well, if I knew that stuff, maybe the novel would have made sense in those terms. But it didn't work. Anyway, that didn't work for me.
Okay. Well, I thank you, CJ. I do want to mention a couple of things about the narrator. So I was, like I mentioned earlier, before we started recording, I was reading some works on the narrator, and obviously, as soon as the novel came out, everybody noticed this character who's the narrator. Everybody noticed that he was breaking some rules of narration. Like you mentioned, CJ, the narrator is not, sometimes he has this God's view of the character. Sometimes he is participating. Sometimes he's even talking, right? Remember, he challenges Piotr and tells him he's a scoundrel. So he's almost like, and then of course he himself is not omniscient, as we find out, because he contradicts himself. And he is almost like a friend. I'm thinking of him almost like a Virgil type character in Dante, who takes our hand and helps us descend into this hell of this tragedy, going down around rung by rung, deeper into this tragic plot. But there have been some speculation that he is in fact the narrator. He is a participant in this thing, and he is not a disinterested participant. Specifically, he might himself be in love with Lisa Tushina, which explains a lot of his focus on her, a lot of his depiction of her as this in a positive light, in a very forgiving, very sympathetic way, the way he describes her. And that is something that I have not picked up on while reading this, but it is very interesting to think that he himself had some designs on her or hopes about her, and that's why he is happy to serve as a kind of go between her and other characters, that he is there watching what's happening, after she spends the night with Stavrogin, and he's there with Mavriki Nikolaevich, and he's kind of always there, not too far from Elizaveta Tushina. And that's that obviously makes it more interesting and more complicated, right? So you have the narrator, who is not just this objective or a fully objective part of the novel, but he is in fact a participant, yet the participant who kind of stays out of the light, and we only get glimpses of him. At the same time, he functions as what a journalist is supposed to do, just describing things as they happen, not with full knowledge of what they are, but with progressive understanding of what's happening, and maybe changing his opinion on things. And that's his role as this chronicler, as he progresses, and he himself changes his opinions on things. And he then says, oh, by the way, later I realized that this was happening and that was happening. So he kind of jumps back and forth in this timeline, and he's not, he doesn't really fit a mold. It doesn't fit a particular paradigm of the novel or the novels that have gone before that had a similar type of narration or a narrative from like a third person. And yet, of course, the author himself is there, right? So he doesn't displace the author. The author and the narrator are two different voices, and they don't always coincide. Or in fact, sometimes they don't coincide at all. So that's what I've gathered just by looking at some interpretation of that. Let's see, who do we have? Okay, sorry, Joe, and then Kira.
Yeah, so my internet keeps going in and out. It's been a issue all day. But in any case, you know, I think that the thing that strikes me the most is just how violent the novel is. And I think Doug actually captured it beautifully when he said it's like Shakespeare. You know, the carnage is just like so great that, and this is all being done in to what end? You know, to and that's where it really starts to get interesting, because not in having the context as well as I should with the Russian Revolution, it starts to give you insights as to what happens in revolutions, like that these are the types of things that start to occur. You start to kill, you know, you start to put together a group of people, and eventually the people that are, you know, no longer needed or seen as necessary essentially get eliminated as little, you know, as you go along. And it's just this, all this idea is that this ends justifies the means. Also the interesting thing is how the relationship between the elders and the youngers and the revolutionaries as well. It almost seems like Varvana Petrova and the governor's wife, whatever it may be, that they're trying to capture something that's missing in their own lives, and things are just kind of getting out of control, and they're not even really actually noticing what's going on. And in a sense, I feel like that's the way societies do unravel, is that people are all of a sudden that they are just, things creep up and all of a sudden boil up, and they boil up and they're out of control. I think it's also interesting how each character he develops each character, whether it be Kirillov, whether it be Stavrogan, whether it be Peter, you know, all of these characters, you end up like either feeling an intensity about them, but they are also really representative of such, you know, of figures like Christ, essentially. And you can kind of see that very, very clearly. And how meaningful that really is when you're talking about revolutions, that you're starting to elevate people to a level that, you know, they can't possibly, you know, live up to. And that's kind of what I do feel like happened with Lenin and Marx as well. So that there really was a lot of that people were looking for something. I'm trying to think off the top of my head just some of the major takeaways, but I think that more than anything, it is a critique of modernity and essentially this adherence only to you know, science, as opposed to looking at science as complementary, and how progress is incrementally made through you know, essentially as opposed to thinking everything has to happen at once. And so that therefore you're totally blowing up society and starting over. And that's kind of what happened. And that was really kind of tragic to a certain degree. I mean, those are my thoughts, is that it really does capture, I think, what I do know about the Russian Revolution, but I'm not an expert in that area. It has made me more interested in that particular time, the Bolshevik Revolution and everything. But
yeah, I do want to comment just very quickly before I give the floor to Madeline and then Kira. You know, maybe pushing back a little bit this idea that CJ put forward, that you need to be an expert in Russian history and the cultural sort of underpinnings. You can read this novel in many different ways. You can read it as a political statement, if you will, like what Joe just was alluding to. But this novel is intensely personal. And I think Dostoevsky in some ways is much more interested in the individual than the sort of the political, the social, the all of these things, they are derived from the individual and how individuals think in their head, and you can read it in a complete, I think, in almost a complete vacuum of sort of what's happening in Europe, and just look at it on sort of evaluate on face value of those ideals that they put forward. In other words, do we really think that Lisa Tushina's ideal of living for the moment is the right one? I don't, it doesn't matter what happened before, afterwards, or anything else. In principle, is that the right sort of, or is this like, do we identify with that? Or this idea that a person, this idea that Stepan Trofimovich puts forward, that beauty is something that we need more than petroleum and boots. I mean, you can think about those ideas completely apart from anything that went before or will go after. However, of course, if you do have the context for those ideas, it does make it richer, and it does make it more interesting, because you understand the connection of what was going on in Europe and in Russia at the time with these types of statements about petroleum and Sistine Madonna and drawing apples and eating one. Anyway, Madeline, and then Kira.
Yes, Phil and CJ and Doug, thank you so much. I just, when I think of the enormous amount of prep work that the three of you have put into these sessions, the planning, the reading, the looking at other sources, and figuring out how to guide the conversations, it's been an amazing experience. It's like being back in college.
Without the homework.
Except that I'm no longer 20, thank God. And I have, more than one professor here. It's really been extraordinary. And all these themes that we've discussed, let's say I had read this book on my own over the course of the past however many months, I would never have gotten all of this out of it. I would have come away with a kind of jumble of impressions, some idea of what was going on in Russia at the time, some memories of a couple of the characters, and that would have been it. But the themes that we've discussed, the themes of first-person information, like the first-person narrator or gossip, versus printing and writing, class issues, the status of women, religion, what it was like to sort of import French philosophy and society wholesale into Russia, which had a very different background. All these different things, I would never have seen them. And I think for me that the magic of the novel is that all of these themes and more are going on in it, and yet they feel very embodied in the characters. They're complicated people, not just like characters on a page, like the detective represents this, and the housewife represents that. They're multifaceted, and they do things that are kind of odd and out of character and unexpected. And somehow Dostoevsky has made them come alive like as living beings. Well, I don't want to get into like the whole world of Plato's theory of forms, but there are the themes, and there are the people who embody the themes.
Yep.
And they're completely interwoven. They're inseparable, just the way things like that are here in the real world. So anyway, thank all three of you. It's really been incredible, and everyone who's been participating, I've gotten so much out of everything people have said. So thank you.
Thanks, Madeline. I do want to say that I think the benefit is not just due to the three of us, but the whole group, because we all enrich each other. That's the game here. Like I was mentioning, some of the connections that you've made, Madeline, some of the connections that Doug made, some of the connections that CJ made with the chronicler, or different emphases and different perspectives. None of us would have gotten it on our own, but together, reading together like this, that's why I like book clubs, virtual or otherwise, is that you get so much more because of sharing of these different vantage points, especially in a work as complicated and as multifaceted as this one. we definitely need multiple vantage points. And I was very curious to see how, in some ways, outsiders, you being outside of the kind of the Russian culture, the Russian bubble, if you will, how you would interpret it and how it would strike you. And in some ways, it's been very, you obviously have different takes than what I would have expected, but also at the same time, very universal takes. As some themes are so universal, they transcend one particular culture. They transcend one particular period in history. They are universal themes, and which makes them, puts them on the same level as Shakespeare or Dante or Tolstoy or some of these other great writers, which makes it worthwhile. Kira, go ahead.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about the ending of the novel, and this might also be along the points that CJ was making about understanding. I feel like it kind of has, formally, Dostoevsky has a different approach than a lot of what we expect from novels now. There's a lot of complexity and a lot of exploration, but that exploration happens during the course of the novel and not so much in the way the novel concludes. I think we often come to contemporary literature with an expectation of a resolution of some questions being tied up or resolved. Maybe we don't expect like a moral anymore, or an overt message or lesson, but we expect something sort of similar to that. And this novel doesn't do that. The questions are raised and explored, but the answers aren't provided. There's plenty of judgment in the novel. It's satire. Everybody is sent up in one way or another, but all the judgment happens during the events of the novel, and the judgment doesn't come at the end at all. There's kind of a glibness and an ambiguity that is embraced in the novel. I was just looking up the last words of the novel, and they kind of reminded me of the end of the fete, when he kind of like concluded, and thus ended the benefit for the ladies' mission. It was so funny the way he ended that whole brouhaha. And the novel ends in the same way. The last words are, "At the inquest, our doctors absolutely and emphatically rejected all idea of insanity." And that's it. It's a very abrupt ending. He doesn't conclude anything or make any kind of concluding statement. The narrative just stops. And I think that probably added to CJ's experience by kind of ramming home that there's not necessarily an answer that we can. I mean, that's the mystery of human nature, isn't it? That we can't really nail it down and fix ourselves over generations. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kieran. I agree with. I think that's a great point about the ending. It's almost like a newspaper article, isn't it? In some ways, reporting whatever happened, and there's the conclusion. The doctor didn't find anything, and then that's it. That's the end of it. That's a great observation. Jeannie, go ahead.
I think that, despite all the religiosity, the idea of whether social change requires violence and overthrow, whether the disruption of society has to precede us actually making changes, remains on the table. And I think that's really, to me, that was the thing that like kind of slapped me across the face, because peace and love just really hasn't worked very well. Maybe as time goes on, yeah, they were right back then. Yeah, right. Peace and love was the answer. And I mean, Stepan dies, and he's like kind of the peace and love representative, and yet his death is such a fizzle. I mean, it's why is he even dying? He's dying because he couldn't hack it out in the real world, or but the idea you know, do governments have to topple? I mean, does everything have to be overthrown? This is something I hadn't really spent a lot of time thinking about. Now it's more, you know, if I had my opportunity, but I don't think, you know, of course I won't. But
Right.
if I had my opportunity, I would maybe be my own Peter Berkovinsky.
With that segue into the goals, and we didn't really talk much about Peter, unfortunately, ran out of time. But I do want to just mention one statement of him, where he says, "Am I a socialist? I'm a scoundrel." He says, and then he talks about the power grab and kind of the ends justify the means types of scenarios, and then methodology. But it's very clear that he's not any kind of idealist like his father was, and he's very much a pragmatic person who is looking for whatever it is he's looking for, whether it's destruction, power. He's ready to step over anyone and everyone, and he will scheme and do anything. And when you say, Jeannie, is it necessary? Well, you may not think so, but someone else like Peter might think, yeah, it's necessary. So that's the problem. I guess one of the things that Dostoevsky kind of explores is this explosive nature of individuals that are in society who can take advantage of other individuals that are not, I guess, grounded in any way, because he basically takes advantage of these people who can't say no. And then we have people who can say no, like Libatkina, like Kirillov in some way, and some of these other characters, and they do say no, and they oppose him, and they perhaps maybe belatedly restore some sort of semblance of order and resolution to this. But yeah, Maritza, go ahead.
I'm not sure where to go now. You had said you were opening up for general comments.
Yeah.
Sorry, you changed totally changed things up for me.
Did you need a moment to sort of?
No, what I was going to say was, so I'm just gonna ignore what you just said. Sorry. I was left at the end of this book feeling that it was a cautionary tale on the futility of trying to bring about change in one's society based only on the say-so of one man. I mean, that wasn't the only theme that I got from it, but I mean, if you think about it, well, I guess this is a little bit about Piotr. I mean, his five, we never really got confirmation or negation on whether or not there were other factions. It was always only alluded to throughout the entirety of the book. I personally think there were no other factions, but I don't know for a fact. That was never explained. And these five were non-thinkers. And they just followed along, I mean, to the point of murder. Even not being okay with it, they just followed along. And I am left with the feeling that the moral I'm giving here is, you know, it's not okay to blindly follow anyone. So, you know, we're shown all this stuff that's the perceived wrongs of society, and we show a perceived attempt to bring about a change that's supposedly going to be grandiose, but at the end, everyone dies, everybody. So it's just like the futility. So it's almost like, you know, if you allow one demon into your society, you all become demons and you all will perish. The end. That's kind of the way it seemed to me.
That's true. I mean, that's the novel in some ways, in terms of like what happens. Absolutely. Yeah. Allison. Allison, you have your.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I feel like reading this book is making me want to go back and reread the other Dostoevsky books that I've read a while ago, like quite a while ago. But it really has made me fall in love with him all over again. And I feel like what I've just always loved is like he has he has just everything in there. He has philosophy, he has religion, he has politics, and he has these absolutely amazing characters that are so true to life. And I really like the complexity of it because I feel like that's what really makes him a genius. If everything was very like simple and straightforward, it wouldn't be as rich and have as much depth. But the fact that you have to stop and think about, like, it's work reading these books. And I feel like I kind of like can only read one every so often because they just, like, at the end of it, I'm just spent, I'm just exhausted. But the thing that's funny about it is like,
Is this an endorsement, Allison, or an effort?
it is, but it's like, I don't even know what the word for it, but the thing that's funny about it is like usually like with Dante, I read the book for what we're doing. And then I always have some other book that I'm reading for myself too. And I have not been able to read anything else. I keep trying and I'm like, everything else I pick up seems like junk in comparison.
Mhm.
So I guess I have to just wait until like kind of like get past this enough and then I can read something else. But like that's like the true mark of it is that everything else is like, like just not as good, So anyway, I'm so glad that we did this because I feel like I've gotten, like Madeline said, I get so much more out of it when we're all reading it together and everyone's different insights makes me see things I didn't see. So, thank you so much for doing this.
For sure. For sure. We're out of time. I just want to say thank you all for participating. It's been really great having you all share like this, and it seems like everybody has gotten something out of the book. I'm glad that it has come alive to you in many different ways, and I'm sure other people will watch this on YouTube and will want to read it. And maybe you'll reread it at some point. I actually think that once you know the plot, and you're not so like you don't have to concentrate on that. If you do reread it, it becomes a lot easier, maybe more enjoyable. I've enjoyed it. This I think this is the third time I'm reading this, and it's been a lot easier and more enjoyable just because I already know kind of what's happening. So I concentrate more on specific conversations and just thinking, taking the time to really delve into it, think about it, and kind of dissect it slowly without hurrying through it. Anyway, again, thanks everyone. There'll be more meetups to follow after this one, after this series. Thank you all. And CJ and Doug and I will be in touch about that. So have a good evening. Again, great time, enjoyed it. Have a good night.